All right, Joe, we are back on the podcast where we are training men in spiritual fitness. And Joe, I've got a bit of a problem I want to bring to you this morning. And I actually, I had a visual aid. I was going to bring like a show and tell, but I forgot it inside. So you'll have to imagine with me for a second, Joe. Imagine that I've got a stack of books that I'm showing you, all right? Because I've got this stack of books inside, and they're great books. Some of them you would recognize. They're books for men's discipleship kind of stuff, men's spiritual growth kind of books that I've read and enjoyed myself that have been helpful for me, books that I've handed out multiple copies of to other guys that have needed a push in their growth. But here's the thing. Here's the problem I have. As I'm looking at those books, what I'm seeing is a lot of books that are very reactive. They're coming to guys at a point of reaction. So it's the kind of books I would give to a guy that would come to me and say, "Hey, Evan, I got caught. Maybe he got caught, in an affair. Maybe he got caught looking at porn, and his life is kind of a mess right now. And you know what? I've got a couple of books, a couple of great men's programs I could send him to that I would recommend. Or maybe he comes to me and says, Evan, I'm addicted. Well, I got some books and programs that I think could help a guy like that, or even a guy that came to me and said, Evan, I've got scars. I've got deep scars from my life, things from my past. Maybe it's personal sin that led into, a downward spiral kind of thing, or it's things that were done to this guy in his past that have affected his life. There's some great material out there for guys like that. But again, a lot of the issue ultimately there is that a lot of these books are approaching men from a point of reaction. It's saying, here's where I'm at right now, and I need to react to this situation in my life. I got caught. I need to do something about this. And I'm like, I don't know. Part of me is like, where are the books? Where's the programs? What are we doing to help men to be proactive? For men to be able to use some of that, New Testament language of, you know what, I live above reproach. It's not that I got caught. I'm living a life above reproach. I'm aiming for holiness. Where do we send guys, normal guys, to grow in holiness and to have that kind of desire? And I guess, look, there's a lot of reasons we could talk about why is there this issue. But one I would point out, I think, as I've thought about this, I think some of it just comes down to simple supply and demand, right? So there is a heavy demand for books to help guys who got caught, for books and training programs to help guys that are struggling with scars and addiction and stuff. And again, great material. I would hand it out. I'm all for it. But it doesn't seem, on the other side of things, it doesn't seem like there's a great demand for just books and programs that are aiming guys towards holiness. Ordinary guys that aren't struggling, aren't in a place where they got caught and addicted, aren't at the bottom of the barrel where they're like, oh, I got to do something now. But guys just feel compelled every day to do something to grow in holiness, just because that's how they want to live. I don't know. I feel like I don't see a lot of that and a lot of demand from guys.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. I mean, I wrote a book on fighting sin. I guess it's been out for about a year, and have led groups, and it's been a conversation point for the last year often. And I think one thing that surprised me is a lot of the book came out of just the fact that looking into my own heart, like there were, really ugly passions that I knew needed to begin to be fought against. And the assumption being that, like, okay, all the other Christian guys in the room that they're having similar struggles and everybody else wants to do similar battle. And I think one of the things that honestly is a little bit disappointing to me is how often when this topic's raised, if you look at guys, and if they're not in that place where, like, they're looking at porn, or there's verbal abuse of their wife, or like something really dark and ugly, they just don't really feel like that there's that much of a battle against sin in their life. And there's not that sense that there's really something to be training for, and that the little sins are actually big sins, and that beyond the sins, there's virtue. And like you said, there's this huge horizon of holiness that's worth pouring ourselves into that effort to, get as close as we can by the grace of God. So there's something that guys need to just trigger this deeper passion. We're going to have those moments where we are going to have to react.
Yes.
But we always want to be proactive. We always want to be in that place of running like Paul for the thing, that's before him.
Yeah, I think that part of the issue that guys face is a lot of times we're just aiming for being less worldly, right? Because we're told to do that, right? Like be less worldly, but we don't see the other side of that, which is be holy, right? Right. That there is something to aim for. And that's a lot of what we're trying to attack in this season of the podcast is, we're all familiar with the seven deadly sins and those things that are ugly and awful and that we should avoid. But it's one thing to avoid those, one thing to put those sins to death, but then it's, what are you pursuing? What are you aiming your life at? Is there anything to go for? And so to be able to give guys some virtues to pursue. And so I think the one we're going to talk about today, it's a little big. I think it's a little big, but it is one of these groundbreaking, give your life something to aim at and aim for. So I want you to kind of go into describing it for us. This is the virtue that we're going to call godliness. So why would you say this is something guys need to pursue, and how would you define it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we've bumped into this in other weeks. There's just like a sense where all of our vocabulary is impoverished. So,
Yeah.
as we're trying to talk about words that depict holy character, we have to use these words. And truth be told, none of us really have a clear sense of what they mean. And when we talk about godliness, there's a variety of words, but all of them sound kind of old and unfamiliar. So, you can think about like words like piety or being religious or kind of devotion or again, godliness, and they're all getting at something similar, but I think guys are going to struggle. And so here's my definition of godliness is an abiding awareness of God and a desire to please God in every thought, word, and deed. And it's this kind of aptitude that we develop where, first of all, we know that we're in the presence of God, a holy God, not some of the time, not just at church, but all of the time. But it's not just that awareness, it's the actual desire to live a life devoted to that God, such that whatever we're doing in every moment is, with him in view and ultimately for his glory. And this is something that, for a lot of us, we've got moments where we feel close to God, again, maybe in a worship service, and then we're in the workplace and he feels like he's in a different universe. And godliness, it closes the gap between these spaces and moments in life to where it's as if everything is holy, everything is sanctified, everything is for God, regardless of what you're doing, when you're doing it, or where you're doing it. And so godliness is the term that kind of captures that attitude of the heart.
That's good. I feel like it's when we say godliness, and even as you described, it sounds so big and so broad in some senses. So I do want to help guys kind of drill down. Okay, what exactly does that look like in the everyday? But I think maybe let's start here. Maybe a good place to start is to say where in the Bible do we see the New Testament, right, pointing us towards godliness, something in particular? Because it's one thing to say, well, man, yeah, honor God with everything you do. I guess, is there a passage that you would go to say, okay, here's where, even the early churches were being told this virtue was important?
Yeah, you see it. First Timothy, the word comes up several times. There's a couple of Greek words that sometimes get translated as godliness, but maybe the best place to point guys to this is First Timothy 4, 7 and 8. But it says Paul says, train yourself for godliness. For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. It's such an interesting verse because one, Paul says it's something that we can exercise ourselves in. So we can develop ourselves. We can undergo training and become, increase the godliness of our life. And it's funny in this verse because he actually holds out a kind of incentive. He says it's something that has value, yes, in the life to come, but actually in the present life, that there's something good that can be achieved and a benefit you can experience by becoming more godly right now. So I think that's one of these places where Paul is telling Timothy, pursue this, rigorously train yourself in godliness, make this an excellence of your character that's increasing. And that should be, inspirational to, I think, men, today.
Yeah, I like a couple of words you used there that are compelling for me as a Christian man. Exercising ourselves and training, like the active part of that, of saying, hey, this is not something you're just going to fall into. In fact, I think we even get a picture from the Bible that if you're going to fall into anything, it's going to be ungodliness, right?
Yeah.
Right. But that godliness is a training and an exercising ourselves. This virtue, as again, it's something to pursue and to aim towards. So I don't know anything else from the Bible that you'd want to point out there.
I think one thing you see is it's not just a matter you want to pursue godliness, but the problem is if you're not pursuing it, then you lapse into what the Bible calls ungodliness.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, a passage here, Titus chapter 2, starting verse 11, it talks about the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age.
Mm.
And that's really strong language. It talks about renouncing ungodliness and worldly passions. I think right now we live in an age where people are so afraid of a kind of worldliness that would take their pleasure away.
Yeah.
But we're not so concerned about living for God in such a way that keeps us uncontaminated. And like you said, above reproached earlier. And, Paul, he puts together some different thoughts or some different terms that are related, self-controlled, upright, godly lives in the present age. Again, this sense that everything we're doing is being done with a sense that it needs to be upright, it needs to be correct, it needs to be according to God's righteousness. We've got to control ourselves. Passion very quickly becomes, a tyrant rather than a servant for us. And so this godliness is a real battle. It's a real effort required to live a godly life in a present age, as he calls it, because the present age, it's an age of temptation. It's an age of godlessness. It's an age where we're constantly being pulled, by our base desires back towards sin in our former practices.
Mm. So you've kind of outlined there the two different ways you can exercise yourself, I guess, exercising and training in godliness. But then you gave that other example of the other direction of ungodliness. And maybe it'd be important to just camp out there for a second and say, I don't know, help me understand what are some of the dangers of going that way towards ungodliness that guys need to be aware of and pay attention for.
Yeah. The fact is, it's a scary thought, but we can produce a kind of moral pollution through our choices and actions. We can live in a way that is actually opposed to everything that God stands for. Mm-hmm. And we live in a world, in a culture that wants to train us to live in that way. Mm-hmm. It's the way we did live before we knew God. And so it's easy to lapse back into the old habits or to adopt the patterns of the world. And I mean, if we just think of our particular age where, we've got so much technology, we've got so many things that are feeding our mind, feeding our behaviors at all times. It takes a real effort to figure out, how do I live in this world, but not of this world, in a way that can really stand out as holy and devoted to God. So it's a huge challenge to actually resist that current.
Yeah, I think some of the dangers for guys are going to be obvious too, as they start to think about, okay, if I choose not to pursue godliness, there are those dangers. We've kind of talked about some of them. Those dangers of the obvious sins. Guys struggle. We talked about porn, talked about even just affairs and addictions and all kinds of stuff like that. There are those very obvious flagrant sins, I guess mm-hmm. you could say, that are a dangerous part of not pursuing godliness. But what else would you say guys need to pay attention for and say, okay, I mean, I think all guys know that there's those big things out there. But what else is lurking out there that guys need to look for?
Yeah. I think what happens with godliness is all of a sudden, you begin to realize that the little things matter because you are in the presence of a holy God. If you think of like the priest in the Old Testament, how aware they would have been in that sacred space, that there's something dangerous in one sense. There's something, so grand that the angels are, covering their eyes in the presence of this holy God, that they're serving that God. And so things that maybe wouldn't seem that significant, the cleanness of their garment, it matters if you're in that space because you're in the presence of a holy God. And so I think when all of a sudden you realize this is what you see throughout the New Testament. I mean, Peter's talking about in Second Peter chapter 1 about this need of supplementing faith with virtue, virtue with knowledge, knowledge with self-control, self-control with steadfastness, steadfastness with godliness. Yeah. That once this comes into your faith, then all of a sudden everything takes on a degree of importance and sanctity because you are constantly in the presence of a holy God.
Mm.
So there's a kind of seriousness. And I know a lot of guys are afraid of seriousness because we don't want to lose the ability to have fun. But if we think culturally, we tend to live really kind of vain lives, lives
Mm.
that are filled with a kind of lightheartedness. And what we struggle in modern times to really recognize is, no, I'm in the presence of a holy God. How
Mm.
do I actually carry the right kind of sober-mindedness with me, realizing that the same God who, when Nadab and Abihu brought strange fire into his precinct, and they were consumed by his holiness, I'm in the presence of a God that holy. And the blood of Jesus doesn't give me liberty to do whatever I want. It calls me to be a priest, to live my life in a way that really honors and respects and reveres and gives glory to such a great God as we read about throughout the scriptures.
And if I can push back a little bit there, I mean, it does sound so serious, Joe. It sounds so straight-laced and serious. I'm not going to say boring, because obviously being in the presence of God and acting as if you're in the presence of God, that's not boring. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it just does sound so serious. Are you suggesting a ban on humor? Are you suggesting that there's no? I don't know. Do you understand my pushback there? Like, it's so serious. It seems like, well, there's just no room for humor in this.
Yeah, no, I think there certainly is room for humor. There certainly is room for fun. There's room for play. There's room for all the good things that God has created, placed in this world. Um, but if we're honest as men, if we're looking at the world around us, everything around us wants us to live superficial lives,
Yeah.
wants to remove any reminder that there is sacredness, that there is holiness,
Mm.
to strip that from our worldview and to position us as if this world is ultimately a playground and I
Mm.
just need to maximize, my fun for the moment. That's not the picture in the scriptures. Israel does not exist for the sake of its own, fun and games. Ultimately, it exists as the covenant people of God in the Old Testament to serve him, to extend his mission. The church, we've got a mission. We've got something we're meant to do. Part of it is to display God's grace, but also his holiness, that
Mm.
there's something that is higher that we're meant to live in accordance with.
Mm.
Now, the truth is that doesn't take away our joy. I mean, as we get to know God, as we reflect his holiness, there's a deeper pleasure and fulfillment that we can find. But there is a moment to sit back for most men and realize, oh my goodness, holiness is real. This deepens my life in ways I never would have expected. And it summons me to a calling that, to be honest, I'd resist if I didn't have to take it up. And I want to say something about that because I think part of this godliness, there's a verse that I want to call guys' attention to from Leviticus. And it was part of the priestly calling in the Old Testament. And it's not something that many of us will have thought much about, but I think it's really important in the present age. And so I'm just reading from Leviticus chapter 10, verse 10, but it talks about you are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And
Mm.
so part of being a priest was to actually have to think and figure out what is unclean, meaning
Mm.
unworthy of God, and what is clean. Where is their freedom? And part of the complexity of living in this world is none of us can bypass the responsibility of distinguishing between the clean and the unclean, the holy and the profane.
Mm.
And that's really hard. When you actually turn on Netflix and decide what you're going to watch with your spouse, at the end of the day, is it clean or is it unclean? When you're
Mm.
listening to the radio, is it clean or is it unclean? When you're listening to, your podcast, is it clean or is it unclean? There's no law to legislate this, but every man is responsible to go do that hard work of figuring out, no, I can laugh at this. I can have
Mm.
fun with this. And,
Mhm.
that's funny, but actually I can't laugh at that because it's unclean.
Mm. That's helpful because although there is a seriousness to it, I think that you have gotten back to that original guy I was talking about. Like, and my original problem that I have here is that I'm looking for ways to help guys be proactive, in have something to aim for, not just be reactive. And a lot of what you're saying there is be proactive in what you are going to choose to watch. Don't just drift with the current of culture, right? And that ultimately what you're saying, like, if you just drift with the current of whatever's around you, whatever does pop up and is popular on Netflix that everybody's talking about, if you just kind of drift along, that's how guys ultimately land in that place of, okay, now I need something reactive because I have it's gone down a downward spiral into something that now I'm not a person I want to be. And so you got to, yeah, choose to be proactive in the, I like that idea of the clean, the unclean, choose for yourself and be it's going to take a little more effort, I think, from guys. It's certainly going to take a lot of work to do. But okay, so let me help the ordinary guy here because when I look back at your definition here of godliness, an abiding awareness of God and a desire to please God in every thought, word, and deed. This does sound like a virtue that's meant for monks and not for math teachers, if I'm honest. Like, oh, the abiding presence of God and everything you do and say, this is, that, yeah, if you're a monk, I think you can go all in on that. So I don't know, convince me that this virtue is for the ordinary Christian man.
I think all of us, we'll start with just mission. All of us are on mission. All of us are sent out by Jesus to be his ambassadors. And part of this is if we're going to reflect his kingdom in the math class or in the boardroom or in the gym or wherever we are, it's going to mean, being people that reflect him and not the world. And so there's no way we can talk about him, but if our life is betraying everything we're saying, we're not representatives. And so, in a sense, our whole life we want to be a statement that there is a God, that, and this is his character. And that's going to be revealed through our compassion and our kindness and our love and our graciousness, but also by the fact that, in a sense, we say no to evil because it is evil. In the same way he judges is it evil, we judge. It's not our job to judge the sinner, but we don't participate because it's evil and not of God. So there's that whole missional aspect. But then the other side of it is in terms of our own communion with God. The truth is that, you don't have to go to a monastery to live in communion, daily fellowship with God. All of us can have moment by moment fellowship with the Almighty God. But the way you do that, it is through preserving, the sanctity of your heart. It's by being the bride that doesn't want her dress spotted. And so that whole sense that I can do what I want and indulge in my sinful pleasure, but still have God, there to, kind of give me a hug whenever I'm ready to receive his love. That's not how it works. There's such a thing as grieving the Holy Spirit. So if we want to be in the world as a witness, and if we want to have that close, intimate communion with God, godliness is going to be essential to keep in step with the Spirit.
Yeah, I think some of what I'm hearing you say there is just that this virtue of godliness for the ordinary Christian man, it has importance relationally, with others that are around you in your workplace and your family, that kind of stuff. But then you also pointed to it has an importance relationally with God, that this is ultimately not only about how do we act and everything around others and what are the relational impacts there, but also just that awareness of God. And I think, I don't know, maybe it'd be helpful too, maybe talk a little bit about just, shouldn't this, pursuing the virtue of godliness, shouldn't this help guys with having a growing distaste of dishonoring God? Like, isn't that part of the Christian life for the ordinary Christian man, not just monks?
I think that's right. I think what should happen is all of a sudden, rather than just being worried about the flagrant stuff,
Yeah.
The whole purpose, you think of the whole tabernacle and the aromas, the fragrance, the offerings, it was to please, you read about a pleasing aroma to God. And what we want is our lives to be a pleasing aroma to God. And whatever it is, whatever the stench is, we don't think it's a big deal. We think it's just a sarcastic comment, but the truth is it cuts somebody down, leaves them feeling really hurt. That's ugly. Jesus doesn't like that. And if it displeases him, it's not godly. It's not godly. We shouldn't want it in our life. And so, yeah, caring about the small things because they matter to God. When you begin to care about the small things, I think there's a huge marker in terms of growing in godliness.
Yeah, I think that goes both ways, right? To care about the small things that you don't do, but also
Right.
care about the small things that you are doing in life. Because part of what you're saying here, I think, too, is every small thing you do ultimately points towards growing in godliness, ultimately has value, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Is this whole life that's lived defined by him.
Yeah.
That's what, that's what we're talking about.
That's good. All right, so let's help guys get there then, and talk about how do men begin to grow in this virtue of godliness? And I can tell you for sure how guys cannot grow in this virtue of godliness. I know ways I've seen it done wrong, and that's, I guess I would tell guys, don't be that guy, that does get caught, or that does fall into, addiction or something. And then he sees growing as godliness as a 12-week course. Okay, if I just do this 12-week course, I'm going to fix this one thing and maybe grow a little closer to God and maybe fix some relationships. But at the end of that 12-week course, his pursuit of holiness disappears. It's gone. It was a limited time thing. So I guess I could say, and we all know probably from experience, what pursuing the virtue of godliness isn't. So maybe give us a picture of what it is then. If it's not just some 12-week course or one book that we read, what does it look like in our practical lives?
Yeah, I think, there's a few ingredients. It's like a recipe. One is growing an awareness of God. The more we practice his presence, we carry just that sense that he's always with us. It's like the Jeff Bezos boardroom where you have the empty seat, to always picture Jesus there with us. So, it starts with that awareness of God's presence, but then you got to add another ingredient. The second ingredient is knowing God as he truly is.
Oh.
A lot of men haven't thought much about holiness, and we need to know, God's attitude towards sin, just how holy he is. And so it's that awareness of being in God's presence, but him being a holy God. As we begin to put these things together, and then we begin to want to please and do things, for him. And that's where all of a sudden it becomes critical to begin to make these distinctions between clean and unclean, holy and profane. And so, in terms of an everyday exercise, just to get guys started, I would encourage them to ask that question. Take up something really basic from your lifestyle. Maybe it's a show that you've been watching. Maybe it's a radio station you like listening to, or a band that you like listening to. And whether it's with a spouse or a friend, ask the question, should I be listening to this? Why or why not? And the goal is not to make a law that if you keep the law, you're righteous. That's not the approach. That's legalism. This is about pleasing God and just wanting to delight his heart. And so asking a question, well, is this something I'm free to enjoy because it's clean and it honors him, or is it not? And honestly, there's a lot of hard questions. There's a lot of great conversation that come out of that. And it's a virtue, so it's going to take a whole lifetime to grow into maturity with this. But start by being willing to ask questions, think with a deep desire that you actually want to please the God who's given his son, to free you from your sin.
That's good. And I think that's a great practical place to leave guys, is just to say, hey guys, go out this week and read and meditate on that scripture, Leviticus 10:10. And what are the practical implications for your life? Maybe, like you said, taking time to be proactive and say, what does it look like to please God in my daily choices? And I guess we're at it, expand that a little bit. I think how do guys grow in holiness? I think one step is don't do it alone. Like, surround yourself with people who also crave holiness, who also crave growing in godliness. And those are the people you have these conversations with. Like you said, Joe, being able to ask people or bring people along in this and say, hey, here's where I think that I need to say, this is clean, this is unclean. And maybe asking that of your friends and creating conversation around that. Create that with your wife and with your kids at home. But surround yourself with those kind of people that are asking those questions, encouraging you to ask those questions. And then don't expect holiness to happen overnight, right? It's not, you're not going to make one choice and then it's not a 12-week course or whatever. So we really want to aim you towards getting on a path of growing in godliness. And I think that something simple like meditate on Leviticus 10:10 is a great place to start, and then have those conversations with your friends. So y'all give that a try this week, see what happens, see what kind of conversations you can create. And then y'all join us again next week, because we're going to continue talking. I think we got one more, Joe, one more virtue that we're going to talk about, trying to get guys aiming for something in their life. So y'all join us next week.